Welcome back. I'm Tyler, you're watching LWLN, and today we're going to talk about a book that is to the human appetite as a pipe bomb is to a truck full of orphans. Somewhere among the viscera of small children is my will to live, and if you ask me if I'd rather read this again or have a front row seat to a plastic explosive overturning a school bus full of the parentless, I'd have to ask you how many orphans we're talking about and if one of those little raincoats is provided, because this dress is dry clean only, and I'm confident the lady down at the Quickie Wash will turn me in if I show up wearing earlobes and stomach tissues I didn't bring from home. I suggest you read this thing if you'd like to feel the human spirit crawl out of your esophagus and hit the pavement with the wet thwap of congealed tofu. And this is the only warning you'll be getting, nothing good will follow this sentence. Anyone who stays past this point is either spoiling for human misery or has the emotional potential of a potted plant. So, for the uninitiated, what is Lolita? Not to be confused with Lolita fashion, a Japanese street fashion started in the 1970s with heavy feminist leanings based on the celebration of all things feminine, which is what I'm wearing because I can only approximate serotonin if I'm dressed like a cake topper became a person. Lolita the book was published in 1955, written by Russian-born Vladimir Nabokov, and is essentially a novel about how a 37-year-old man marries a widow to gain access to her 12-year-old daughter. The widow dies, and then the world's longest, most boring road trip ensues, occasionally interrupted by repeated graphic depictions of our protagonist doing things to a child that you can't Google without Chris Hansen bursting through your window, brushing off the glass, and getting in a few minutes of content before you're sent to prison and they find your body in a security camera's blind spot, dickless, and missing several key components to being alive. Our two main characters are Humbert and Dolores Hayes, who he nicknames Lolita. Humbert is an unreliable narrator and a prolific liar, meaning you can trust him about as far as you can stand him, and we learn very little about his victim, Dolores, because our protagonist's primary occupation is to be a malignant narcissist who can't go 2 seconds without reminding his audience that he is the smartest, most good-looking man to ever walk the surface of the earth. This man is R, I am very smart, and R, nice guy's hemorrhoid-encrusted child, and I have never wanted a fictional entity to perish of spontaneous combustion of the anus more fervently in my entire life. Back to the point, this book's major twist is that Dolores escapes and was actually in love with a different pedophile the entire time, and Humbert murders him out of spite in a hot lead pedo slap fight, which sounds like it would be fun to watch until you realize that Nabokov's style is the literary equivalent of sloth pornography, which is to say slow, freakish, and once you get past the unnerving exterior, the most boring thing you will ever have the misfortune to experience. Humbert is arrested for homicide and driving like an idiot down the wrong lane of the highway, and the book ends by delightfully informing us that his bohemian rhapsody victim has died giving birth to a child from a deaf man while living in a rundown shack at the ripe old age of 17. Turns out it didn't go well with the pedo she ran away with, given that he wanted her to participate in his kiddie porn videos. And somehow, with all that said, this abysmally tedious book has been said to be a love story. Which brings us to our second section of the installment: how was Lolita originally received? Perhaps knowing that what he'd written was essentially a thinly veiled extended fantasy of graping a child, Nabokov initially intended to publish this excuse for a book under a pseudonym. His manuscript was immediately turned down by no less than 6 publishing companies, and he was forced to stoop to publishing in France, the novelist's last resort when their work is too debauched for civilized society. The company that took it was essentially a purveyor of literary pornography, meaning that the book's initial reception was crickets, given that most people don't like to publicly declare what they're using to wax their candle. It was only by the last gasp of 1955 that a review from Graham Greene finally instigated a torrent of attention from those not purchasing suspicious amounts of lotion, resulting in England banning it in a moral panic, France following suit in 1956, and the wretched novel reaching notorious status, causing it to sell like hotcakes. And by the time it made its way to America in 1958, it hit the bestseller list like a child-molesting meteor. An ever-growing list of American critics leapt forward to gobble Nabokov's Johnson, and in true American fashion, immediately got down to the task of explaining how a bald-faced tale of forcible assault of a child in lurid detail, hardly obfuscated behind a whisper-thin veil of metaphor and a thesaurus worth of pretension, was in actuality a love or hate note to American architecture, culture, highways, motels, or the quote, American emphasis on the attraction of youth. Because fuck them kids, I guess. I swear this country is that one person at the party that will not shut up about themselves, and I suggest the rest of the world get a mop because the national circle jerk continues with one critic saying, with scarifying wit and masterly descriptive power, he excoriates the materialist monstrosities of our civilization. Praise that is swiftly seconded in Charles J. Rollo postulating, it surely justifies, at least in part, those critics who have seen in Lolita a satire of the romantic novel of old Europe in contact with young America. Except that young America they're talking about stood up and smacked the kibbles and bits out of its European captor, causing them to flee back across the ocean, berryless and bleeding. While Dolores is not granted the luxury of fighting back, her escape only lands her in the hands of another monster, and the 2 seconds that we do see her as a somewhat free person, Nabokov casts her as a child bride who dies from oopsie-daisy killer baby. And with all that said, these articles on our national self-obsession are not even the worst takes on Lolita. When it's not being regarded as some grand satire, metaphor, or twisted moral instruction, Lolita is and was seen as a love story. People were willing to put their godforsaken names on that line, and none more so than in the following TV interview with the author himself, in which one critic boldly declared that what Nabokov had written was actually a tale of ardor.
My reading of the book led me to feel that despite the judgments that a good many people have made on it as a book about sex and sexual obsession, that although it is indeed a very erotic book, a very sexual book, if you wish, it is not a book so much about an aberration as about an actual love, and a love that makes all the terrible demands that almost any love makes, certainly that any sexual love makes, but that is very full of tenderness and very full of compassion as well as passion.
The man speaking is Lionel Trilling, one of the leading critics of the 20th century. And he went on to say that the real reason that Nabokov used the demented torture of a small girl as his literary instrument was that he was reconstituting the shocking nature that used to characterize the great literary love affairs. He then placed adultery in the same camp as CSA, and if you don't believe me...
And it occurred to me to say that this particular love that Mr. Nabokov had chosen as the love object of his hero, a young girl, someone who is usually preserved from the sexual attentions of men, a very young girl of 12, as I recall, because he wanted to reconstitute that the shocking nature, the scandalous nature that once used to that once used to characterize the famous love affairs, the love affairs of great stories.
You think that love should be scandalous and is no longer scandalous? Is that what you're trying to say?
I don't think that love should be scandalous. I'm a very respectable man. I think that all the great love stories have been scandalous. For example, they have been adulterous. They have been stories not of love between married people, but between people who ought not be in love.
Let me interrupt.
Nabokov then agrees with Trilling that Lolita is a love story, which is a feat in and of itself, for reasons I will reveal later. And given that I am seconds away from heaving myself, my breakfast, and my faith in humanity into oncoming traffic, we'll summarize to say that outside of praising it as a love story, critics also seem to agree that Lolita was beautifully written. They appear to think that that was impressive given the subject matter, and were all too happy to pat themselves on the back for noticing, unlike the vulgar laymen who were justifiably horrified, meaning that all you needed to publish CP in 1958 was a teaspoon of alliteration and the vocabulary of a mildly competent parrot. Never underestimate the unregulated drug of pseudo-intellectualism. And in quick summary, we've learned that the general critical consensus on Lolita around the time of its initial publishing was crickets, followed by praise for its writing style, people deciding it was a love story, and finally, presumptions that it was one big metaphor for insert half-baked bullshit that helped them sleep at night here. Thus wraps our exploration of how Lolita was initially received, which takes us to our third section, how is Lolita perceived today? One would think that in the era of Me Too, fine-combing works from the past for issues, and general evolution for the better in popular morality, a book like Lolita would be on borrowed time. One would also be presuming that the Twitter mobs would actually read something that contains no wizards, but then again, that relies on the assumption that they'd read anything at all, especially if they could could save themselves the trouble by taking whatever some anime profile pic tells them as absolute gospel. This side street of my distaste for the Tweety Bird app aside, for now let's have a look at the 2005 review of Nabokov's Lolita, written by Charles McGrath, published in the New York Times. McGrath describes the story as the tale of a suave European immigrant who, quote, seduces a 12-year-old American girl. I'm going to withhold my thoughts on referring to forcible grooming as seduction for the time being. And he moved on to say that, quote, it's true that Lolita makes the first overt move, but no one in his right mind would write any longer, as Robertson Davies did when defending Lolita in 1959, that the book's theme is not the corruption of an innocent child by a cunning adult, but the exploitation of a weak adult by a corrupt child. I can't help but laugh at a man who seems to think himself evolved from the creeps of the 1950s, yet is still using the nickname a pedophile assigned to his child captive and not her actual moniker. And now that we have a moment, let's not let it pass that he also seems to believe that a child can make any kind of move on an adult, first or otherwise. A concept that is incorrect out the gate, A, because Humbert already made the first move by physically harassing Dolores multiple times beforehand, including rubbing his pixie stick along her leg until he reached completion. I wish I was joking. And B, children cannot initiate shit with any adult that isn't already on an FBI watch list. You are not distinguishing yourself like you think you are, McGrath. You're just parroting the same bullshit in a poorly updated package. He even goes on to write that Humbert is also a brilliant monster, a touching one, even lovable at times, before quoting our previously addressed critic, Lionel Trilling, with, Humbert is perfectly willing to say he is a monster, we find ourselves less and less eager to agree with him. Which means I'm going to have to revoke Trilling's privileges with the word we on the grounds of sheer presumption alone. And to take this back to McGrath, the fact that anyone could possibly describe Humbert as lovable in any capacity after having read even the most basic description of what he did to Dolores speaks to a deep rot in his personal character that is unlikely to be excised by anything other than a weed whacker, a Bible, and the kind of constitution that makes one likely to survive the combination. While we're on the subject of pontificating on people's bedroom antics, another recent review on Lolita written by American novelist Edmund White simply cannot be ignored, as he's quoted in an interview with the New York Times as saying, Nabokov's job in the book is to make you like the monstrous Humbert. In the 1960s, readers were too swinging to see how evil he was, and now readers are too prudish to see how charming he can be. My entire generation is obsessed with thirst traps and fucking each other in the ass, and this 80-something-year-old tosspot has just called anyone who disagrees with him a prude for being appropriately disturbed by an adult kidnapping and raping a child. Most of the people I know are into some version of BDSM, half of them have an OnlyFans, and if I see one more person on my timeline sporting their birthday suit before the jaded eyes of God, I will reincarnate as a goldfish and curse you all from my watery grave. That said, it has not escaped me that the critics that are quick to see themselves or have sympathy for Humbert have overwhelmingly been male, so in an effort to level the gender playing field, let's take a look at a review published in the New York Times in March of this year by well-known actress Emily Mortimer. The review espouses some familiar notes of praise as well as presumption, as Emily states that, quote, the novel is also written in brilliant prose, it's impossible to retreat to any kind of moral high ground when you read Lolita, and Lolita is one of the most beautiful love stories you'll ever read. How so many people keep reading it as a love story, I don't know, but hell if I won't take a look with entirely unbiased eyes and hands definitely not millimeters away from dialing 911. So what happens in this love story? Well, a 37-year-old man tries to drug his 12-year-old victim so he can rape her in her sleep, becomes her stepfather for incestuous reasons, plans on drowning her mother so he can assault her without interruption, and lies about her mother's accidental death so he can kidnap, isolate, and assault her to his heart's content. He tries to get Dolores to jerk him off in a parking lot while he watches children leave school, assaults her while she has bronchitis. He repeatedly threatens her with a scary orphanage if she tells anyone what he does to her, repeatedly withholds basic comforts unless she performs sex acts on him, eventually starts paying her an allowance for raping her, and then steals what little pittance she makes from the trauma so she can't run away, hurting her, quote, very badly in the process, backhands her across the face, case, plans on impregnating her so he can eventually rape their daughter, and then considers raping any resulting granddaughter. But remember, this is a love story, and if you still believe that sentiment, please leave your brain in the bucket on your way out. It's clear it would better serve as a doorstop than whatever empty purpose it's carrying out in your skull. Also, he licked her eyeball at least once. I know that's a minor point, but someone else needs to suffer this knowledge before I start screaming in crowded places. Again, this review casting Lolita as a love story was published in March of 2021, and Mortimer isn't even done as she asserts that we end up not only empathizing with, but also loving a murderer and the rapist of a young girl. And it feels really good. It feels like a deep relief, it feels exhilarating and paradoxically cleansing. I would like to take a moment and point out that this is the only instance where I've seen a reviewer actually refer to Humbert as the rapist that he is. So it's a real shame that it came out of the mouth of a woman who I'm fervently hoping wrote this all as the side effect of being dropped on her head. Only serious cranial trauma could remotely explain feeling cleansed after bearing witness to graphic depictions of CSA, and a decent amount of hemorrhaging in the frontal lobe would explain her assertion that, quote, Lolita remains unassailable because it disarms you and transcends judgment. The obvious answer being that nothing transcends judgment. Jesus Christ himself was judged, trussed up, and nailed to a cross. And I certainly don't believe that a book wherein a 37-year-old man rubs his disco stick on a 12-year-old girl until he ejaculates on her left butt cheek is going to accomplish what the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost couldn't do with all the powers of God and anime on their side. The author of the article finishes up her hogwash with advice for those who'd like to read Lolita, and her recommendation is that you relinquish concern with right and wrong and just feel things as another person feels them. The translation of which reads, just turn off your brain and it's all good, making it a ringing endorsement from a woman I'm presuming unplugged her own like a toaster oven. But what really gets my goat is this critic's drivel was actually a good demonstration of the present thinking on Nabokov's Lolita. She's absolutely not an outlier. And in a remarkably similar summary, the common interpretation of this book is still that it's well written, a love story, makes you identify with a monster, and again, it's actually some grand metaphor because these people need some excuse to enjoy their kiddie porn that will pass muster in an academic setting. So in short, in the roughly 60 years since Lolita was first published, nothing has changed. A concerning discovery, which brings us to our fourth and my favorite section, why Lolita is hot, sweaty garbage. I've told you about the critical reception for this book then and now for a reason, and that is because at their very root, the most common interpretations are dead wrong. Let me play you just a bit more of the interview from earlier.
The critics, as Mr. Nabokov knows, have said a great many things about this book. I'd like to see if he agrees with them. I'll quote some of them to you. One critic called it a satire on sex, a mirror of human frailties. Another said that it was a joke on our national cant about youth. A third that it was a cutting expose of chronic American adolescence and shabby materialism. Is this so? Is this what you were intending?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Well, first of all, I don't wish to touch hearts, and I don't even want to affect minds very much.
So, any critical interpretation that casts Lolita as a book written with the intent of satire or some grand metaphor is wrong. All the defenses associated with assigning this story some greater purpose that only the enlightened and detached will appreciate are now null and void, which leaves us with three major critical claims. That it is well written, a love story, and makes you identify with a monster. Points I'm sure I'd agree with if I had the mental capacity of pudding and didn't think this entire book to be a cheap parlor trick to contrive the reader into believing that what they're reading is an abominable trash. I think we've covered enough points as to why this isn't a love story to make you appropriately nauseous. At no point in this book did I once identify or sympathize with Humbert in any way. And as for the writing style, when Nabokov wasn't committing the moral sin of depicting the rape of a child as if he was painting the Sistine Chapel, he was committing the literary sin of boring the fuck out of his audience while he was at it. You know how TVs in hotel rooms are programmed to go to that one welcome screen that tells you all about the building, amenities, local weather, attractions, and other other services? That channel you immediately change to something else because 2 seconds of it has your gray matter melting out of your ears in agonizing dullness? Well, toss in a bunch of unnecessary French and slam it face first into Roy Moore's court docket, and you will essentially have Lolita the book. To prove my point, please enjoy an example of this scintillating text that definitely didn't make me want to walk into the ocean. It was then that began our extensive travels all over the States. To any type of tourist accommodation, I soon grew to prefer the functional motel, clean, neat, safe nooks, ideal places for sleep, argument, reconciliation, insatiable illicit love. At first, in my dread of arousing suspicion, I would eagerly pay for both sections of one double unit, each containing a double bed. I wondered what type of foursome this arrangement was ever intended for, since only a pharisaic parody of privacy could be attained by means of the incomplete partition dividing the cabin or room into 2 communicating love nests. By and by, the very possibilities that such honest promiscuity suggested, 2 young couples merrily swapping mates or a child shamming sleep to ear witness primal sonorities, made me bolder, and every now and then I would take a bed and cot or twin bed cabin, a prison cell of paradise with yellow window shades pulled down to create a morning illusion of Venice and sunshine when actually it was Pennsylvania and rain. We came to know no canoom, to use a Flaubertian intonation, the stone cottages under enormous Chateaubriandesque trees, the brick unit, the adobe unit, the stucco court, on what tour book of the Automobile Association describes as shaded or spacious or landscaped grounds. Keep in mind that I've only subjected you to a few short paragraphs. There's still some 300 odd pages to go, and no, it does not get more engaging from here. That said, the utter drudgery of reading this thing is only countered by the continuous frustration of having to Google Translate the random bouts of French it contains, because the author likes to hide creepy shit in there. Keep in mind that Lolita was originally published in the 1950s, so most of his readers were shit out of luck unless they had a frog eater on hand. Personally, I don't think French is ever necessary, but I'm biased, and my perception of the language is colored by my first experience with a French speaker. I'll leave this thumbnail here for specific reasons. Please do excuse my post-traumatic dialect disorder. Returning back to the topic at hand, this leaves us with the common critical takes that Lolita is both well-written and makes you identify with a monster. I'd say the only people who could possibly identify with this monster incorrectly read him as standing for some greater purpose. The rest of them aren't allowed within 5 miles of a school, and now that we know that Nabokov at no point intended to spread or imply any kind of message, the only people who could possibly identify with him now share Humbert's inclinations and should be summarily pushed into a river. Meanwhile, this man's writing style has the charisma of room temperature cheese. I've read grocery store coupons with more pep, and while it pains my soul that this has to be said, using polysyllabic words and abusing a thesaurus does not make someone smart. Those who would be taken in by repeatedly tossing out $10 words are likely the same people that think Jordan Peterson is remotely intelligent. Those same people are now taking a break from cleaning their room to be incredibly upset with me. A point I will have little remorse about, given that both Nabokov and Peterson are smart men for stupid people, and I expect most of their fan base will have a little trouble typing without forgetting to breathe. All I'm saying is, it doesn't take that much skill to fashion a flowery sentence, such as this entirely real excerpt wherein Humbert says, "My only grudge against nature was that I could not turn my Lolita inside out and apply voracious lips to her young matrix, her unknown heart, her nacreous liver, the sea grapes of her lungs, her comely twin kidneys." And disturbing imagery of eviscerating a child aside, you could use that same style to describe a toilet, and I've saved you the trouble of imagining it. Please enjoy the following nonsense. "My only grudge against the maid service was that I had run out of triple ply. No one had restocked the tissues, and in the cold breeze of central AC, I consider my options. It's not looking good for the bath mat. In the recesses of my mind, I note the scraps of Charmin that cling to the empty toilet roll. The AC has set them aflutter, and they dip and shiver, waving the white flag of my surrender. I am about to forfeit the security deposit." My ridiculous posturing aside, what I am trying to say to those who are still impressed with Nabokov's sentence structure is that you need to consider what purpose it serves. Because to put things bluntly, if you're going to depict the assault of a child in flowery, hypersexual terms, you better have a fucking point or you're just getting off on it. So what was Nabokov's point?
Mr. Nabokov is also saying, as I gather, that he has no message at all in this book.
Well, I don't feel I have any special message. If you ask me, for instance, whether my own ideas are those
of Humbert, the main character in the book.
No, I would say no. Of course, he's a European and a man of letters, as I am, but I've been very careful. I've taken great care to separate myself from him. For instance, the good reader notices that Humbert confuses, just to take an instance, hummingbirds with hawk mouths. Now, I would never do that, being an entomologist.
Having learned that Lolita is neither satire, overarching metaphor, or created to inspire any kind of message, we are left with a single conclusion. He just felt like it. He felt like it, but he is making a point on separating himself from the crazed pedophile that he created, and the reason that he isn't like said pedophile is because Humbert incorrectly identified a bird. If only Epstein had pointed to a pigeon and said, "Look, a duck," he might be alive today. And this leads us to an interesting place, because if Nabokov has gone out of his way, unprompted, to try and distance himself from this character, I think that might call for a little digging. You absolutely know where this is going. And after an embarrassingly little amount of effort, I came upon exactly what you'd expect me to find. You see, for a man who claims not to be like his pedophilic protagonist, he sure does like to write about grown men trying to assault underage girls. A lot. I've prepared a little list, and just a sampling. Given that I don't have the stomach or time to translate Russian, there's A Nursery Tale from 1926, wherein the protagonist tries to make a teenage girl part of his collection. There's Laughter in the Dark from 1932, in which a middle-aged art critic lusts after a 17-year-old girl. There's The Enchanter from 1939, about a middle-aged man who, quote, lusts after a certain type of adolescent girl. And last in this list, but certainly not least, there's Lilith from 1928, a poem written from a dead pedo's perspective, in which the audience is treated once more to the front row seat of assaulting a child in a sexual sense, once more in flowery language, once more for no other perceptible reason than the author just felt like writing it. Please look no further, this is all healthy and fine for an adult man to hyperfixate on. No need to keep an eye on the elementary school parking lot at exactly 3:40 p.m. I'm sure he's still wearing pants. That said, Lilith at least ends with the protagonist actually being in hell, but that is the final line, and I am at this point less inclined to believe that this is a message that the monsters in our society will receive their just eternal fate than I am to interpret this as the author feeling himself to be embodying the same eternal torture in the here and now. The point is, this type of behavior from Nabokov is a pattern. He seems to have fixated on grown men assaulting or trying to assault little girls over a period of decades. And while I cannot pry open a dead man's mind and tell you with confidence that he was a pedophile, I do think we can ask the question, exactly what type of man would write such things without a very, very good reason? What kind of person would view, as Nabokov does, a relationship between a 37-year-old man and a 12-year-old girl as a love story? And given the trend we've seen here today, what are we to do with such a work if indeed its creator is as I suspect? It is this very question that brings us to our fifth and final section for the evening. The fact that it's unfiltered garbage aside, what value does Lolita have? It may surprise you to hear this, but even after everything I've told you today, I do not advocate for banning this book. I don't trust giving any governing body the power to start torching novels in any sense. And yet, now that I've established Lolita to be absolute tripe, you might be scratching your head as to why I'd like to keep it around. You'll be forgiven for your shock when I tell you that Lolita, despite everything I've said today, is in actuality an incredibly valuable book. Its value lies almost entirely in something I've never once seen anyone laud it for, and that value is, succinctly, in its rendition of the inner workings of a sexual predator. But what's particularly telling and horrifying in the same instance is that Nabokov, by all appearances, did not write it to be so. No one ever praises it for that reason, and it remains even to this day a book touted as a love story. Regardless, this book is a field guide to the motives motives, justifications, and self-centric worldviews predators like Humbert exhibit. And when read in the context of studying the predatory mind, Humbert is practically the hallmark of how these abusers think about and attempt to consume and control their victims. His rampant sexism, urges for violence, his megalomania constantly at war with feelings of impotence, and will to dominate and dehumanize his target on every level are all classic cards of sexual abusers. And just for a few short examples, his overt hatred of women is impossible to miss, as he calls anyone above the age of 16 an animated merkin, a hag, fat, stupid, ugly, or an empty vessel for his desire. The emotional and physical abuse of his first wife is remarkably in line with the escalating nature of what this type of mindset leads to when left unchecked. His plans to hurt her very badly when she brings up divorce correlate neatly with a predator's obsession with controlling their target. His overt sexualization and literal dehumanization of Dolores, even casting her as a demon who seduced him, falls in line with casting the blame on the victim for his actions. And the steadily increasing amount of inappropriate touches leading to sexual assault, culminating in kidnapping and repeated rape, are practically a case study of the ultimate ends of what this type of man will do if he is given uninhibited access to his victim to enact a slowly boiling pot of abuse that adults and children around the world still fall victim to today. So once more, I believe this book has immense value if it is taught to adults specifically as an example of the inner workings of the predatory mind, both so that those who read it will have a better understanding of the gradually escalating nature of abuse, and to prime its readers' minds to recognize and protect themselves from the predators they may run into in their own lives. For just like Nabokov wrote Humbert as a stepfather who repeatedly assaults his stepdaughter, this book is a reminder that the monsters are not jumping out of the bushes at night. They're so much closer to home. I'm going to go dunk my head in a bottle of Everclear. This has been Tyler, you've been watching LWLN, and I'd like to take a moment to thank my patrons while I'm still sober. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate your patience while I made another video no one asked for. And should you like to join their number, you can head over to patreon.com/lastweeklolitanews for more content should you be spoiling for punishment or just feel like ruining your day. Thanks again, guys, and I'll catch you next time. One more thing before you go, I couldn't find a place to put this in the video that didn't feel like swerving into a side street at 50 miles an hour, but to address this very self-interested topic for just a moment. After having swum through Humbert's absolute hatred of women of all ages, sizes, and dispositions, along with his special distaste for women who he thought dressed youthful in any way, if I ever hear someone say Lolita fashion is remotely like the book ever again, I'm going to box their ears, shove this novel into their face, and say, look at this, you deflated souffle. What I'm trying to say is that Humbert would have hated Lolita fashion, both for being worn primarily by the grown women that he despises on every level, and for those same women, in his mind, performing a vulgar minstrel show of the girlhood he hopes to pervert. So those who say that Lolitas wear this fashion to attract a pedophile like in the book have obviously never read it. And if they had, they might have noticed that in the 300 pages of absolute torture, not once does Dolores wear anything remotely close to Lolita fashion. The first time he sees and becomes obsessed with her, she's wearing a polka-dotted kerchief and shorts, and the rest of the fracking book, she's either wearing boys' clothes, sweatshirts and shorts, a 40s-style dress, or fracking blue jeans. Levi's are not Lolita, and neither is anything else worn or included in this terrible book. I've read it in its entirety, so you don't have to. Now go forth with the knowledge that the Lolita community has been right all along. The Lolita like the book fashion you're looking for is the nymphette community, named after the term that Nabokov made up to describe the type of young girl that Humbert wanted to sexually assault. You're welcome. Now please keep your demented interpretation of Lolita fashion to yourself, look up the definition of homonym, and kindly fuck in the direction of off. This is actually the end of the video now. Thank you, good night. Now go get fucking vaccinated.